Everyone, welcome to this first session in our series of webinars about the delivery of an integrated transport strategy. We've got lots of great speakers, so I'm going to be nice and brief here. Today's session is about enhancing transport integration through data-driven analysis. So today we're going to be hearing from Tom, we're going to be hearing from Tara. If we move to the next slide, we've got Hayden and we've got Avion from Sistra, talking about various aspects of this. My name is Sally McNamara. I'm a director in the social and market research team at Sistra. This is particularly interesting for me because my role is more talking about behaviour and looking at how people behave. I'm really excited to be hearing from our speakers about the magic that goes on behind it and how to actually create an integrated transport system that works seamlessly for the users. So we've got ways of interacting. I will be monitoring the Q&A. So if you want to interact with our panelists and if you want to help us have a really lively discussion later, please post questions on there as we go through. There is a chat. I'll keep half an eye on it. That's probably more for people watching to interact with each other. So if you post questions on there, I can't promise they will get to the panelists, but we will certainly be monitoring the Q&A. So let's get started with our first speaker. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Sally, and good morning, everyone. Can I have my first slide, please? And that's my topic. My job today is to set the scene, to make a few points about data-driven analyses in particular, and hopefully that will stimulate a discussion. As Sally says, please through the Q&A channel. I don't have answers. I have lots of questions and I also have opinions. Now, I'm a transport planner, but my main area of work and interest is, as many of you will know, transport modeling. So you won't be surprised that I will regularly refer to what data-driven analysis may mean for traditional modeling. Will it help? Will it hinder? Let's see what the discussion leads to. And a spoiler alert now, what I certainly don't expect is that data-driven analysis will replace modeling altogether. But then you wouldn't expect that conclusion to come from an old die-in-the-wool like me. Next slide, please. When I started my career in the mid-80s, and I mean the 1980s, not the 1880s, we mainly planned for and collected data for traffic, the movement of cars and lorries on the roads. Mainly roads, but in the Netherlands and of course in cities also bikes. Now, a decade later, we actually started talking rather than about traffic, about transport, considering that planning needed to be multimodal, that all modes needed to be reflected, and actually that these modes interact. Move forward another 10 years and the term mobility emerged, which brought the human element into the mix, the movement of people. But despite the change in terms, our focus was, and of course still is, on moving and movement. Making this movement of people and goods better is our objective. And much of the valuation of benefits relates to this as well, for example, through the value of travel time. But things are changing now. It is recognized not just in our profession, but also politically, that transport and movement are not necessarily good in themselves. They're good because they are enablers, and of course sometimes disablers of wider societal benefits. Social cohesion and inclusion, health, opportunity, and this is recognized in the Labour government's missions, some of which I've set out here in the slide. Economic growth, health, safety, and opportunity. Now, what does this mean for data? Well, obviously, our analysis should not just continue to focus or report on transport outcomes, but particularly on these wider benefits. And that's not always simple. For example, transport alone won't make the country healthier. Non-transport benefits cannot always easily be ascribed to a particular transport intervention. And it also requires us to look more widely at non-transport input data sources. First of all, as transport is a derived demand, but also as other data sources can provide insights into travel demand and travel patterns. Sales data, whether it is coffee sport via an app, house sales via Zoopla, these are all part and parcel of those wider impacts and wider impacts on travel and transport planning. Many years ago, I predicted in the company that I worked for at the time that the transport planning team and profession would be absorbed in the wider planning capability that we had. Now, that didn't happen. We actually grew in size. But I can see signs again that this might be the future for our profession. Can we continue to approach transport planning, data, and modeling in isolation? So almost all of the data we traditionally collect is focused on that movement of people, of goods and vehicles, probably because it's easy and it's cheap. But as a derived demand, and particularly as increasingly activities that can lead to travel movements are carried out digitally, our data needs to focus more on the activities, particularly the activities that did not generate a movement, be that a day working from home, be it a Teams call that replaced a business meeting, be that a delivery to the home instead of a shopping trip or a visit to a restaurant. These could have been made on the road in the real world, but they may be made like that in the future. So part of the data challenge is to understand and record all activities, not just those that led to transport movement. And one of the data sources that is quite interesting in that respect is, for example, the time use survey by ONS. Another consideration is that most of our surveys, we focus on collecting data segmented only by consideration about the transport and travel related differences between groups, behavior chain differences, vehicle types, groups that display, as I say, different travel behavior or have different trade-offs between time and money. Now, transport as an enabler requires much more segmentation in the population by characteristics that matter to those non-transport outcomes, gender, employment status, and certainly much more further detail in the socio-demographics of the people that we are trying to serve. Next slide, please. Now, data-driven is, of course, a useful term, and I think as a transport modeler that I am always data-driven. My work is always data-driven, and that hopefully my work leads to evidence-based decision-making that is also based on observed and through models synthesized data. But data-driven also means that we constantly need to keep a lookout on data insights that challenge our view of the world, the assumptions that we don't often enough query. For example, and this won't surprise you, and you will relate to this, many of our analyses work on the assumption that there is a thing such as average day, that the worst traffic conditions occur during the morning peak, that commuting is the problem that needs solving the most, and that we can ignore weekend travel. Now just look at the graph at the bottom left, which I pulled out from Road Traffic Estimates Great Britain 2023. On weekdays, the evening peak is substantially heavier than the AM peak. And of course, as we all know, it's much more complex in terms of its constituent purposes, education, work, other activities, not just that morning commute that we focus on so much in the past. Fridays are very different from Mondays to Thursdays. And personally, although the data didn't allow me to find out, I expect Mondays to be quite different from Tuesdays to Thursdays as well. And perhaps most surprisingly, the midday peak on weekends is actually heavier than the AM peak on weekdays. And I don't think we've used data to understand what kind of trips are made. So what does it mean for data and the topic of today? It's not just about using data to look into the future. It's very much about understanding today better through this data-driven analysis. And this is exactly what a plethora of emerging data sets should enable us to do. What causes this new weekend peak? Who are those travelers? What did they do before? Who don't we see nowadays in these sort of road and public transport related data? Has this increased or decreased equity? Is there a trend, or have post-COVID changes stabilized? Lots of questions that are really important. So the good thing is that this level of detail in the data is available nowadays due to this constant monitoring that is done through data data surveys and non-surveys that are there, that are on all the time, 365, 24/7, rather than, let's think about the good old days, the tube counters that we needed to put down for 14 days, let alone manual counts that were carried out for a single day. But also sales data, for example, from credit cards, GPS traces from apps used by travelers, both during and at the trip and afterwards at their origins and destinations. Here we go. I hear you say data-driven, therefore, doesn't mean we don't need models anymore. But I'm afraid I will disappoint you there. We will continue to rely on models, but in a different way than we have done until now. In the past and during most of my professional career, we have relied on models to fill in what I would call the holes in the data that we collected. We were, in essence, data poor. Roadside interviews and station surveys collected around 10%, perhaps, of the relevant traveling population. Household surveys perhaps as little as 1%. They were carried out irregularly, maybe every 5 or 10 years, or ad hoc for projects. Traffic and passenger counts, speed surveys covered only part of the network. And the point of modeling was, and generally still is, to derive these statistical mathematical relationships from this sparse data and use these relationships to fill in with synthetic data where we don't have observations. Now wind forward to the present day of big data. We are no longer data poor, but data rich. I would say uber rich. Available data sources contain partial information about many aspects of the trip or traveler. We've got aggregated data about flows and speeds, but also unconnected data about individuals. Sometimes we've got multiple, often conflicting information points. So my point is that we will still need models, but now to give structure to that lake, or do we call it a swamp of data? And the types of models can change as well. Machine learning and artificial intelligence, of course, we need to mention those. But they are only possible because of this plethora of data, and they will make a difference. But remember that they are still models, and certainly, from my perspective, even blacker boxes than the models that you're used to see, whether you love them or hate them. Now, I've got a couple of terms here on the slide that I didn't invent, but I do like them. I want to share them. Yeah, we need to start thinking differently about these new artificial intelligence models, recognizing that there will certainly be, for the foreseeable future, a need for human inputs and interpretation. So let's talk about machine teaching instead of machine learning. Yeah. The machine finding relationships in the data that we couldn't identify ourselves, helping us as humans, but not replacing us. And similarly, artificial intelligence being recognized as co-intelligence, that we as domain experts work with rather than are replaced by. Domain knowledge will remain important. Now, the overall theme is integration, and I want a few pointers for discussion about this down as well. And Hayden and Tara will talk later more about the integration of data, but I'm interested in the data needs for understanding transport integration. So, for example, integration of modes. Rarely a trip is made that truly consists of a single mode, perhaps apart from walking. Yeah. And I can accept that perhaps for most people, a cycling or car trip could also be unimodal, or is it monomodal? I'm not sure. But think of all current PT trips, public transport trips, and in the future shared mobility trips. Ignoring modal integration doesn't do justice to the complexities of an integrated transport system. So what's needed is much more detail on the individual legs of multimodal trips in our data collection and analysis, rather than just focusing on that main mode. A train trip is also a car, cycle, or walk trip that's used for access and egress. And active mode interventions can support public transport or extract patronage. I think of, in the Netherlands, 40% of Dutch train passengers actually cycle to the station, which enhances both active mode usage and public transport usage. Do we really capture that? Can we capture that in the current way in which we capture and analyze data? Second area is integrated land use and transport planners. We know how important this is for developing sustainable communities and decarbonization. But is this based on anecdotes and human logic, on perceptions, or is it supported by data-driven analyses? What data is missing? I haven't got an answer, but it is worth exploring. And finally, as I already said, it's important to recognize that not all activities need to result in active movement. So we need to have much more insights on the activities that people undertake rather than the movements that they make and the decisions that they make on how to link them. Traditional household surveys won't do that. So do we need different surveys? And what do they look like? Okay, I think that's enough in terms of scene setting, but let me stop with a commercial break. In June again, we will organize Modeling World, where topics such as this will definitely be on the agenda. So if this is your area of interest, have a look at the call for papers. Juliana at Landor and I will be very pleased to hear about what is happening in your world in terms of emerging data sets and techniques to support integration. So let me leave you. Oh, sorry, have we moved on with the slides? I have forgotten to tell you now. Keep going, keep going. Goodness me, I should have told you all that. Let me leave you with this thought. Data isn't smart. It's only what we do with the data that makes it smart. So back to you, Sally.
Thank you, Tom. That was really interesting. I love the visual of a swamp of data. It kind of makes you think about how messy it is and how much you've got to get through. I found that really interesting. I like the idea that you need to be using lots of different data sets. So, you've got someone's journey available, but how they feel about that journey is a whole different thing. If you look at, for example, my commute, it's an hour and 45 minutes, but that's including a lovely walk to the station and sitting on the train doing lots of work and focused work, which you wouldn't necessarily get from just looking at data. So I think drawing on the ONS and the government data about how people feel about it and how people are using that time and how people value that time is really useful. So thank you for setting that context for us so clearly. I'm going to move on to Tara now, who's going to be talking from the Open Data Institute. Hi, Tara. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally, and thanks for having me today. I'm Tara Lee. I'm a senior consultant at the Open Data Institute, or ODI. And we work with organizations to build data infrastructure, knowledge, and strategies that create trust in data and data practices. And we bring together businesses, governments, and civil society to generate economic benefits and tackle real-world challenges using data. So ultimately, our aim is to build a world where data works for everyone. And although Tom talked about smart data previously, I'm talking about smart data with a capital S. So today I'm going to be talking about the possibilities that come with smart data. I'm going to start off with a bit of an explainer as to what we mean by that smart data, a reflection on the development of open banking and the progress and ambitions that are in place for other sectors to date. And then I'll be handing over to Hayden to talk specifically about transport and smart data. Before I do that, I'll also just give you a little bit of information about the Smart Data Challenge that we're currently running with the Department for Business and Trade. So if I can get the next slide, please. So to get started, what is smart data? So smart data is the secure sharing of customer data upon the customer's request with authorized third-party providers, or ATPs. And the ATPs can then enhance the customer data with broader contextual business data, which may be provided directly to ATPs or may have been made as open data. And customers might be individual consumers or business customers. So in summary, smart data relates to customer data and business data. So for example, related to products, transactions, and service usage. It's shared in specific formats. So you need things like data standards, timeframes, and so on. It's accessible by ATPs with the permission of customers, and it enables customer data to be actionable by ATPs. So, for example, payments can be made on behalf of customer. And the Competition and Markets Authority, or the CMA, have suggested that smart data schemes, i.e. the implementation of smart data in a specific sector or group of sectors, requires a regulatory framework to govern how the data is shared, common and open data standards that reflect the dynamics of the market and minimize the risk to competition and consumer, participation of data holders, third parties, and regulators, effective representation of consumers and other end users, a funding model that reflects consumer interests, interoperability with other smart data schemes. So as Tom talked about, it's not just about transport data in isolation, it's looking at data from other areas as well, and a practical framework for the delivery of schemes. So if we go to the next slide, please. So smart data is already powering British banking innovation through open banking. And this is sort of the key live example of a smart data scheme in the UK that's already been put in place. So in 2017, the CMA mandated the UK's 9 largest banks to facilitate the sharing of customer data, specifically bank current account and credit card data. And as of actually November 2024, open banking has over 11 million users. So building on open banking, authorized third parties now offer a range of innovative services to consumers and small businesses. So this includes things like round-up card payments to encourage regular saving habits, payment cards that give holidaymakers access to improved exchange rates without international transaction fees, cloud accounting services that help businesses manage their cash flow and taxes, smarter credit checks that give freelancers and small businesses with variable incomes access to loans and credit, the ability to display data from all of the customers' accounts on one dashboard to enable holistic money management, and apps that can analyze spending data to identify opportunities for cost savings, such as cancelling a subscription. And this approach to supporting innovation in financial services has helped establish the UK as an international leader in the development of financial technology, or fintech. So UK fintech startups have attracted significant investment, with many scaling in size, disrupting, diversifying banking services available to consumers and small businesses. And actually now the UK is second only to the US as a top destination for fintech investment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide, hopefully you can read it okay, shows how the government is planning the expansion of smart data into other sectors. Now, I have to ask you to ignore the dates on the slide, as some things have been delayed because of the election last year, but it does still reflect the ambitions and the order of the work that's planned. So I'm gonna let Hayden focus on zoning in on transport, and I don't have time to go into every other one of these sections in detail, but I'd like to give you a quick insight into the finance and telecoms aspects as examples. So open finance is an extension of open banking, like data sharing and ATP access to a wider range of financial sectors and products, such as savings, investments, pensions, and insurance. So we know that finance will be a priority sector. So last February 2024, the Centre for Finance, Innovation and Technology published its findings on how open finance can unlock financial data to benefit SMEs and consumers. The design of open banking regulations under the Smart Data Powers will provide a framework that's scalable and adaptable to future technologies. And respondents to the FCA's call for input highlighted a number of potential benefits of an open finance scheme or schemes, including increased competition. So innovation to offer compelling customer services would flourish, and it would drive competition between firms. Improved financial advice. So open finance would make it easier for an advisor to quickly get a financial picture of a new or existing customer, and product innovation, so including greater tailoring of products to suit individual circumstances and needs. And several respondents saw a future where tailoring could then work across sectors by combining modular products to build up a portfolio of products that work best for a customer. So I'm hoping you can start to see how these things might translate into the transport sector as well. So to give you another example for another sector, the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology has consulted that open communications, so smart data in the telecoms industry, may have the potential to help support consumers and increase competition there. So research by Citizens Advice indicates that around 29% of broadband customers stay with their provider despite incurring a loyalty penalty. And the regulator Ofcom estimated that around 7 million broadband customers are affected by a loyalty penalty at the cost of just under £500 million per annum. In mobile, it's estimated to affect 1.5 million people, leading them to overpay by £182 million a year, which is around £10 per month per mobile phone contract. So the experience from open banking suggests that the data unlocked by smart data schemes might lead to broader benefits by joining with data unlocked by other smart data schemes in other sectors and allowing innovation. And while price is the dominant consideration point for most telecom consumers, a potential future open communications could aid households to identify value for money by showing information about their connections, including upload speed, reliability, and bundled extras. So if you would like to find out more about expansion into other sectors, as well as for transport, I suggest having a look at the Smart Data Roadmap online. It's very easy to find if you search for Smart Data Roadmap. It was published under the previous government, but it's still very highly applicable. And next slide. Thanks. So finally, I'd just like to squeeze this in and let you know about the Smart Data Challenge Prize, which currently has a call open for applications. And this is a challenge which is being supported by the Department for Business and Trade and run by us, Open Data Institute, and ChallengeWorks, who are part of Nesta. So my last slide. So just a little bit of information. There is more information on the website there. So the prize will give up to 10 selected innovators the opportunity to prototype smart data solutions with high potential impact in a specially created synthetic data sandbox. So for this challenge, we've worked with a company called Smart Data Foundry to produce synthetic data sets to prototype with across a number of sectors, including banking and finance, retail, energy, residential property, and transport. So successful teams will be given access to this synthetic data, along with the data sandbox, which is provided by NIA 1. And that provides participants with the tools and data they need to explore and develop ideas into prototype solutions to demonstrate how smart data can transform services across sectors. And the selected innovators will benefit from grants totaling £50,000 each, as well as a range of non-financial support. And following the prototyping phase, the winning team will receive a further £50,000 and two runners-up can receive a further £25,000 each. So as I said, if you'd like to read more about the challenge, you can find all the information on the website smartdata.challenges.org, which is also at the bottom of this slide here. And now I will hand over to Hayden to explain why smart data is needed for transport and the challenge for it ahead.
Thanks, Tara. That's a nice segue and intro. For the next slide, I'll introduce myself after this one. Thank you very much. I'm going to go I've got a few more slides than Tara, so I'll just say my name's Hayden Sutherland. I am the founder and chair of the Open Transport Initiative. Next slide, please. Some of you may have seen the Open Transport Initiative online and the work we've been doing. For the last 5 years, we have been pushing for the idea of the open banking for transport and mobility sector. So even before the term smart data was coined, we have been pushing for the interoperability of customer account data across our wide, broad-ranging sector. I'm also director of a digital strategy consultancy, and I'm particularly known as a transport data architect. I also sit on things like the board of Mobility as a Service Scotland, MAS Scotland, and provide inputs there. But the Open Transport particularly was set up to support the adoption of these customer data sharing schemes. So this is our area of expertise, this is our domain. So next slide, please. So what can we tell you? Well, you already know the transport makes data difficult, particularly for the users. Data is stored in all sorts of different systems, formats and technologies just across one sector or just across one mode. But when you start to get into different modes, there are different online accounts, for example, for bus, rail, taxi, MAS. We know that that's every single mode of transport tends to have its own account. If you're one of the sort of different 20-odd train operating companies, if you're one of the hundreds or so bus companies, each with their own account, let alone the taxi companies. You've heard about smart data in the banking sector. The open banking, and there was just the CMA 9. Those were the original 9 banks that were taught to do open banking. We have hundreds to deal with in our sector. But basically, if you're a customer, you have to dive into, if you want to get a holistic view of your data, you have to dive into all sorts of different accounts to get it. You need to log into an account, view your data. It also means, and I'm going to be quite clear here, There's the GDPR right of the individual for data portability. You can look it up. I won't bore you with it too much because I've only got a few slides. But the right of the individual, basically, by most of the transport mobility sector, are ignored. We're currently in breach of the individual right of the individual to allow them to share their own data and to move it around in a way that they want under their control. The next slide, please. So obviously, that is the current landscape, but it's becoming more and more complex. It's only going to get more complex. We know the public sector providers are developing more apps and websites to support a more complex proposition. We know that transport startups are growing and they're building market share with what they're doing. We know that MAS is maturing across with different future transport zones, and every new entrant comes in, all creating their own new customer account, their own new platform, their own new integration standards that are completely bespoke and proprietary, and transport authorities are trying to build out their own self-service capabilities while still wanting to have a relationship with their own customers. So this is becoming more complex. Next slide, please. So smart data, as you've heard from Tara, is the secure sharing of customer data with third parties, and the most popular being open banking. And that obviously really fueled the fintech sector. And they do that obviously by current standards using APIs. We're trying to do the same in our sector. Next slide, please. To help people understand what we mean by smart data, we can talk about sort of data. This is a diagram from the Open Data Institute, where it actually talks about the data spectrum. On one side, it's the open data, and on the left side, it's closed data, and in the middle, shared data. So if you just click, say, if I say next slide, it will just highlight the next one here. This area shows specifically on the data spectrum where smart data sits. This is data that is somebody shares with another party, an authorized third party. And examples of data might be their transactions, their usage, and their sort of what they can do with that, and their sort of their behavior and how they use that service is all here. So this is smart data. Okay, so this is where it sits on the data spectrum. This diagram here is a diagram that actually is used across multiple sectors. So we're actually using the same definitions here, same way of describing data as other sectors like smart cities, energy, and utilities are all using for this sorts of data. Okay, next slide, please. So the government said they're really keen to set up smart data schemes across other sectors. And obviously they want to go from open banking, open finance, and create that smart data economy, which is multi-sector. So they are considering schemes across that, including transport. And yes, Tara mentioned there's regulations coming out to incorporate, to sort of do a high level sort of primary legislation to improve smart data schemes across the whole of the UK. But yeah, and there'll be secondary regulations come in to do it just for our sector. But we're already seeing this happening across something called the Smart Data Roadmap that you were seeing that Tara mentioned earlier, but we can provide the link to you later on. So really, we need to up our game here from the transport sector from meeting the smart data challenge to integrate into this smart data economy. Next slide, please. Right, you would have heard, and then we talked about, as Tara mentioned, the older diagram of the Smart Data Roadmap. There's transport there. It was supposed to be, according to the old government, launching in Q3 a call for evidence, and energy on the right. If you notice, only last week they announced their call for evidence. So we're actually, as a transport sector, I know this is an older diagram, but we're actually, as far as we're concerned, the transport sector, behind the curve in the take up and being awareness of smart data in our sector. Next slide, please. So where are we with it? If you just do the next slide, it would just bring up the diagram. This shows you the smart data roadmap of where we are. We are really at the beginnings of this, of identifying that if we're going to have a smart data scheme that is multimodal, multi-operator, multi-platform, multi-provider, that we need to really identify what do we need to do, how do we need to do it, how do we prepare for what's coming, and coming across and basically to try and get cross-sector integration, not just with ourselves and integrating transport data, but integrating it to different schemes, to integrating it to finance, to integrating it to retail, and integrating it to other things as well. So next slide, please. Right. What are we doing here? What are the Open Transport Initiative doing? Well, the Department for Transport in the Smart Data Roadmap said it will work to progress smart data initiatives, but we've already created these open APIs. We've already done the hard work for people to integrate data sharing. So we have spent a lot of time being engaged with different people, creating draft and then revised standards for enabling the sharing of this data that is in the smart data spectrum. We've already got these ready. Don't recreate the wheel if you're going to do this, but we've already created those. And we've already created a working group called the Smart Data for Transport Working Group, which are a group of industry sector specialists. So we're sharing knowledge about who's doing what in the smart data landscape, what the plans are. And yes, that does include working alongside from people from other sectors, stealing with pride what they've done in others and working alongside of them, drafting up things such as initial set of use cases, and preparing ourselves for the smart data challenge that Tara mentioned, because we are preparing for different members of the group to pitch and apply for that smart data challenge to show how transport and potentially other sectors can integrate this level of data and take data forward and shared in a smart way across our sector. Right, I think that's it. What I'll say is on the next slide, here's our website and here's my email address. If you have any questions subsequently, or you want to get involved in that smart data working group, please let me know. Thanks very much. Tara, have I covered everything? Was that okay? Thanks. Big thumbs up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara and Hayden. I found it really useful because it was so clearly structured and it looks so straightforward. So I think it was incredibly useful to then go to Hayden to actually talk about the complexities in the transport sector. Tara, what a message I took from yours was that for the open banking, it's a benefit to a customer. So it'd be quite nice because I've seen a bit of a challenge in the chat that actually maybe it's the businesses that are benefiting a bit more. So perhaps we could have a bit of a chat about that later on. And I'm sure people will want us to have a bit more of a discussion about the roadmap as well and where we are and how to get there. So thank you very much, both of you. I will see you soon. So just to round us off before we do that panel discussion, and please do get some questions in the chat if you want to make sure the panelists have a chance to discuss those. I'm going to hand over to Avion just for a bit of a roundup.
Hi there, everyone, and yeah, great to be contributing to the conversation. And I just saw a timely question from Juliana there, which is kind of where I wanted to look at as part of what I talk about at this stage. I've just got a couple of slides and I'll let you know when to move them on. So good morning, everyone. My name's Avion Jenkins and I lead Systra's data science team. Yeah, and today I just wanted to build on what's already been discussed and share some thoughts on what smart data could offer to transport, and hopefully prompt some other questions which we could come on to. I think I should probably add that I'm only just at the start of my thinking on how smart data could, I guess, play out in the transport sector, having attended a workshop, I think it was end of October last year. So just before I jump further into that, so transport generates a vast amount of data every day, as we all know, from ticket sales on buses and trains to data collected on movements via apps on mobile phones and the vehicles that we use to move around in. And the list's seemingly endless. There's a lot of data. I've recently been part of a project to try and map that out, and there's a lot. However, the challenge has always been how to unlock the full potential of data to improve journey planning, optimization, support policy making, and then importantly, improve the travel experience for everyone. We must always focus on that. Unlocking transport data is also the key, I believe, to enabling the significant benefits that AI could offer the transport market. At the moment, I think much of the high quality data that we each generate as individuals when we travel around tends to get aggregated and sold via businesses such as telecommunication companies, vehicle manufacturers, and app providers on our phones. Some data is also open. I also expect much of the data that's generated may not actually be used at the moment. And as an industry, we struggle to surface all the wealth of data generated and understand why people are traveling and how people are traveling. I think from my reading so far, the Smart Data Bill, which is, as we mentioned, going through Parliament at the moment, I think it will help to make more customer data available, and this will enable us to make better decisions. So if you can move on to slide 2, please. So thinking about what could this mean for transport, I think if it's implemented effectively, the bill over time, because things take a long time, should enable greater sharing, portability, that word's been used a few times, of traveller data. I think it could lead to some interesting opportunities in the transport market in the years to come, and will drive more open customer data. So a few examples, thoughts from my perspective to share. So it could enable better understanding of the traveller. I've touched on that a little bit. So the customer data could offer greater details as to why and how people are travelling. It could help enhance multimodal travel integration by enabling sharing between customer accounts that are held in different modes of transport. So a rail account, maybe on Trainline or another provider, a bus operator account, and a cycling account. So if we can combine these, travellers can enjoy a more connected journey experience and see information on each mode in one place rather than in lots of different apps. Perhaps it could support personalised travel services with secure access to travel histories and preferences. Service providers could offer tailored options, reducing travel friction. I guess especially for customers with additional needs who are using more than one mode. It could provide increased control over data. Customers will have more control over their personal data, including the ability to decide how it is shared with third parties. This empowerment can enhance trust in transport providers. It could also go the other way, so it needs to be done right. There could also be an option for users to contribute their data to local or national studies to influence policies. Could it enhance transparency? So data access can lead to greater transparency in how transport services are priced and delivered. I think that area of pricing is still quite a struggle because of the competition that is there in the market, allowing customers to make more informed decisions. It could empower travellers, yes, to find the quickest, cheapest route, but it could also help travellers to make a better choice for the climate and choose lower carbon intensive trips by combining customer data together. I think it will certainly boost innovation and competition. I think this is exactly what the bill is designed. One of the key areas the bill is designed to do is to, the economic growth theme. I think opening customer data securely to third parties can drive new products and services. We've seen that already in the travel app marketplace that's already been created, and I think that will continue further. And finally, I think the bill could support access to more comprehensive customer data that can enable companies to provide a more responsive and effective customer support, addressing issues and inquiries more effectively while on the journey, perhaps receive compensation automatically if your journey is late, and maybe even across different modes. So that's a few thoughts from me. If you move on to the next slide. So, oh, sorry, on the next slide, I didn't realize you weren't on that one. Okay. So just in conclusion then, so I think the bill could transform UK transport by making it more open, secure, and useful data available. I think it could empower travellers. It will enable businesses to develop new mobility services and optimise operations. I think it will certainly support providing insights to policymakers. And finally, I think it will allow us to understand the traveller needs in much greater details. I'll leave it there, Sally. Hope those thoughts are helpful.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Right, so we've heard from all our speakers. We're going to move into the discussion now. So this is obviously your chance to interact with our panelists. I'd like to just start with a couple of questions more about outcomes. So I'm actually going to read this one verbatim. I see a cycle of public transport optimisation at the cost of crucial service provision. How can the data be used to identify opportunities to improve services for the betterment of society without the strangulation of cost efficiencies. I think for this one, I'll just open it. Would any of our panelists like to have a go at answering that one? And then we've got one for you specifically, Tom, about outcomes in a moment.
Look, that's a nasty question that Paul asked there, particularly as we are modelers and data scientists rather than transport operators. So I'll try and, as I said, I haven't got answers, I've got opinions. I do realize that optimization obviously will inevitably lead to the loss of services that are crucial for other purposes. So that's a matter of understanding not just the I think the objectives that we may have or that the government may have, but also the constraints that operators in the end have in terms of being able to provide those services. I think it's no different from other, I think, trade-offs and constraints that we have in other decisions that are being made, whether we make investments that lead to a high BCR because of travel time benefits, or whether we make investments because they achieve other objectives that we have. So for me, the question is about where is that decision making around what objectives, quantified or non-quantified, are the most important. And then, of course, it's about, as this seminar is about, is the data to support that. Evaluation, I guess, is the answer.
My take on that, Sally, is that I think Tom, you touched on it in your presentation as well. So it's not just transport data, but it's wider data sets, and I think it's understanding where the employment opportunities are, and not just being driven by we've got to provide an efficient service, but we've got to look beyond to see where job opportunities are, and data can help us understand that, and that we're then providing the public transport services to meet the needs of the people. I think that's...
Yeah, picking up on that, Afion. See, I'm going to pronounce your name properly. Did you hear that, Sally?
Heard that, yes.
The point is another point that I made, and sorry that the slides didn't move. That was miscommunication. Is it's also so important to understand the trips that are not made, and to collect data on the non-users, and understand what the impact of these kind of investment decisions, financial support to operators, you name it, can have on people that at the moment are not able to use the system. And I think we've been poor at that. And as long as we keep focusing on movement rather than on these wider impacts of transport, I think we do a disservice to society, but also I think we as transport planners keep operating in that silo that I also mentioned. Can we remain transport planners, or do we need to accept that it's not about transport, it's about these wider impacts that transport has?
Yeah, I would add to that. I think if you're, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right or not. I've got a bit of a complex about it now. Your point about the data from other sectors is really important here. So I mean, I can't name the exact study, I have to admit, but I've heard about studies of when we talk about active transport, so people sort of walking and things, and how in Scandinavian countries they looked at what pavements and roads they salted and gritted during the winter months when it's icy, and general consensus was always the commuter routes, right? People going to work and then back from work. But actually, when they looked at people what their other activities were outside of work, so you might go to work, but on the way you have to drop your child off at school, and then on the way home from work you have to go look after an elderly relative and so on. It's not that in out. There's a lot of moving around as well, and when they sort of looked at that and redistributed the salting, so actually no additional cost of services, there were sort of reported huge drops in the number of fall-related injuries in hospitals, and you actually help to improve people's lives in that sort of transport design as well, when you consider the journeys that people take. That's not that in out, but that's looking at demographic information and education related information and other caring responsibilities. So that's a really good example, I think, of how when you bring in data from other sectors, it can help to improve those services overall.
There was a related question actually in terms of the wider outcomes. So we've got this one from John saying that there was an evaluation of Dial-A-Ride for a service with a net cost of 42k per annum. UK PCL recovered 21k from just 3 passengers. And John's asking, how can we ensure that outcome-based evaluations such as this, rather than output-based, essentially financially based models, are accepted by government? This one's quite interesting because I do a lot of evaluation, and I think outcomes like this are very much part of lots of evaluations. And I know that well-being has been monetized, for example, so that can be incorporated. I just wondered if any of our panelists had any thoughts on that as well, in terms of the modeling outputs that you create and the financial models and how we can incorporate these wider outcomes.
I guess you're looking at me again, are you, Sally? Oh, Hayden, switch
I'm
his
looking
camera on. Hey,
directly at you while you're
Hayden
speaking, yeah.
switch his camera on. Come on, Hayden, jump in there.
So
I feel pretty confident saying Tom, so yes, please.
You can always say Tom, and and apologies for the shouty person who's just suddenly decided to pitch themselves next to me. What I could talk about is sort of we're talking about the personal customer data sharing, and you have to share where we talk about, it's your account data and you're sharing it with others. Then may get to a point where we say, actually, I may decide to share only a tiny bit of that high level information, not just with an authorized third party who is acting on my behalf. They might be acting on society's benefit. So you might say, I decide to give just some of my anonymous journey behavior usage, I don't know, the miles I do per mode of transport, to a planner or to planning organization, that they can then use it holistically to craft better services. But the other thing is, we're talking about smart data, it puts the user in control. So when I've got a view of all my journeys, all the transport I make, all the different modes, from walking to cycling through to in a rickshaw, I've got a better understanding of all the things I can do with that. So therefore I can have better, I can in theory get my car insurance could be better. I could do better pay-per-use car insurance. I could plan better, more cleaner, greener, cheaper journeys with what I'm doing. And that greener one is really important, because if I know all the different carbon uses per mode, I can plan those myself. And with things like AI services, you could even then get it to automatically suggest, etc. Now, to say sharing that data then with society, we might be able to do it. We have to build trust with the individual sharing what they do with smart data first, before we then say, can you share it with Big Brother as well? But we have to work on those different models, and that's why we're coming up with different use cases in smart data for transport.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that the data's all there. But I think from all of the discussions today, we've got different stakeholders involved. So from what my takeout from what you've all been saying is that the government is on board with this, and there's a roadmap. They are looking to do this, and maybe you've got some challenge to that. Businesses may be on board where there's a benefit to the business, but there's a big challenge because there's so many different business stakeholders involved that it's trying to coordinate that information. But then a key one is the public and actually giving that access. So for people to kind of have that behavior change of, yes, Big Brother, you can have all my data, that feels like quite a big challenge, because what's the personal benefit? I think the general public's assumption is that transport is, somebody's responsibility, the government, the operator, and they just need to make it work. So do people recognise that they can improve it and recognise their role in improving it? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
So I think I'm going to bring in another sector as an example here again. So if we take medical data, healthcare, we are very protective of our medical data. It's very, very sensitive data. In terms of personal data, it's some of the most sensitive data that we have. And so if you asked people 5 years ago, are you happy with your medical data being shared for research and studies and so on? So maybe not. And sort of there was a general lack of trust and unease about that. And then COVID happened. And we all wanted vaccine. Well, most people wanted vaccines very quickly and as quickly as possible. And we were all, a lot of us were very, very scared. And we started to see the tangible benefits of the ability to share data, obviously sharing that data in a very safe, responsible, and ethical way in order to see the benefits out of that. And that's why when I was presenting earlier, I talked about open banking first, because it's to sort of explain how it works in practice, but also some tangible benefits have already started to come out of that. So I think with transport, one of the things is there might be a reluctance to share that data unless you can see what the tangible benefits and values are if you agree to do that. And one of the real benefits of smart data is you can pick and choose. These are authorized third parties. You're not saying, I authorize my data to be shared with everyone. It's you can say, I want to use this particular service from an authorized third party. Main data controller here that has my data, I give you permission to share that data with that particular authorized third party because I want the benefit of the service that that party is providing that I'm not otherwise getting.
I think that's
Exactly.
one of the strongest use cases when I was thinking through, what can smart data offer to transport, and particularly, we do an awful lot of consultations in this country, and we undertake a lot of surveys, and I think that we already have, all of this data is already generated. If it's for my benefit, if it's going to improve decisions around the infrastructure that's developed, the housing that's developed, then well, personally, I would be happy to contribute my data to a study that could help to improve the decisions. So I think that's really one of the powerful use cases that could come from the smart data.
Yeah, no, I'll just chip in.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, there's 2 points to that. The first one is you're right. There is, and I talk about and I talk about in the chat, there's a value exchange. When you go into and you use your Tesco Club card, you're giving them certain amount of your transaction, your behavioral usage data in return for a discount, a reward, a loyalty discount. There's a value exchange done there, and it's known, it's obvious. We don't provide value exchanges in the transport sector. We don't do it very well. Yes. So, but and there are certain data, and so there's that point. I think we need to be better in saying, if you give us a little bit of data, we'll give you a better service. The other thing is, it's what sort of data do we mean? We're at the Open Transport Initiative, we've defined three sort of data entities that can be shared as part of that data spectrum. The first one is sort of tickets, products. What can I do with my ticket? And that may just be a license to travel within a certain zone or a license to use a particular mode. Second one is actual usage. What have I done? Like your bank transaction history. What have I done? What have I bought? Where have I gone? Where have I gone to A to B? And the third one is concession and discount information. If you think about it, that's the most interoperable you probably need. I don't want to have to constantly prove that, I don't know, my 15-year-old daughter doesn't have to keep proving she's 15 and keep on different modes of transport because she's got a 15-year-old card to travel, whatever it is. My disabled niece doesn't have to constantly prove she's disabled to every single person and validate with smart data that bit to be able to be shared. And by that, we are, as Tara's spot on, is we're in control of not just who we give data to, but what parts of that data as well. I know it might get complex, but everybody's owns their own data. It's their data, and so we should put them in control of it and give them the tools to do that very well. Because if you don't, you as a transport provider don't provide it, somebody else might do a better job of providing that service for you, and therefore they may use theirs instead. So this is coming through. Legislation is coming through to implement smart data across our sector. I think we need to be there across all modes and all data types to meet that challenge.
So I think there's a couple of points that have come out from these discussions. There's an element of modelling. So people, you have actually been sharing your data. It was, COVID, and you saw the personal benefits, or you saw, some obligation to do so for society. I think what strikes me, Hayden, is that you talked earlier about just how many stakeholders are involved, though. And I think, Tara, give people permission, but it still sounds as if from an individual perspective, A, you've got to buy into it and see the personal benefits, but B, you've got to be having that discussion with so many different providers to say, yes, please do share my data for this purpose. And actually, that feels quite overwhelming for an individual. Will that actually will the benefits overcome just the perceived hassle of having to give permission for each of these things? How can we face that challenge?
So I think in transport, my thought on that is in the rail sector, which is going through, it's being brought back into the public ownership at the moment. There should be, whilst I agree there's a lot of complexity around stakeholders, but with all rail organisations being brought into public ownership and smart data, couldn't those two things be brought together, that regardless of which train operating company you're working on, as they're all publicly owned, couldn't we implement a scheme that rail data at least can be shared? So that's one. I think that's probably a quick win.
So
But I
Adrian,
say
where does
that, but
that
they all
come
take a long
from?
time.
But where would that come from then? Does that need to come from the government, or does that need to come from operators agreeing, or how do we get there?
Well, the government last week announced it's centralising retail for your UK train operators. It announced last week it has plans to centralise the retailing for all the different trains. So providing a centralised account for all retailing in the UK is only a next step to say, how would we make that shareable, and shareable then with interoperable modes and other private parties to try and bring a holistic, we talked about that data, unlocking data, but also make a holistic view of it. The very fact that the government has announced these centralisation plans would indicate that it would be a lost opportunity if we didn't enable smart data sharing when we did that.
Okay. And what do we think about operators? Do you think they're open to it? What are the barriers for operators doing this?
Many, well, people like to hoard their data, don't they? So there's definitely sort of a combination of carrot and stick, I like to say, on these things. So there is, do they understand the potential benefits for them? So I mean, it's not smart data, but if you talk about open data, for example, and that's not going to be personal data, but opportunity data, for example, timetables, schedules, all the other sort of things that go on within transport that's not personal data. A large portion of that can be made completely open and can be used in different ways. So Transport for London, as an example, a few years ago, or quite a few years ago now, opened up all of their opportunity data for others to create new tools and services with. And it created tens of millions of pounds of cost savings and efficiencies back to TfL because they made that data open for others to use. Now, they could have said, no, we're going to create all these new services and things for people ourselves. Didn't have capacity, didn't have the expertise to do that themselves. But by others doing it with their data, they've benefited from that. So if you're talking about non-personal data, it may not be that the smart data is what's needed. It could be open data that's actually going to be solving it. With personal data, it's a lot trickier, and that's where I think smart data comes into it a lot more, where companies need that guidance and reassurance as well from government about what is okay to share and do, and these things need to be regulated, and there need to be standards put in place so that it is done safely and responsibly. And in some cases, companies will need to be mandated to make that possible, because otherwise they want to hold all their data, their precious data, to themselves and not let others benefit from it. And ultimately, consumers are the ones who should be benefiting from data about them.
But we are seeing a bit of a change. We are seeing that, yes, data hoarding is power rather than data sharing is power. But we are seeing things change. We're talking to procurement departments and government and public sector procurement officers who are saying, I want to include smart data as one of my requirements in my new procurement of my system. So that's great when they start to include the use of smart data sharing as a requirement in a new public sector system, because that will move people forward to do that anyway. I mean, I keep saying, my common phrase is the Chinese have a phrase, which is the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The next best time is now. We should have had all this thing in place and all these requirements 20 years ago to enable data sharing. But we're now saying we now need to incorporate these data sharing requirements into what I've procured, because eventually, if you don't have that data sharing capability in your application, you might not be included in the procurement in the future.
I think this is all very relevant, but a lot of the benefits I think where people have been willing and to share their data has always been driven by the benefits that they themselves experience. I think, Hayden, your example of a Tesco club card is a good one. Yeah, and I think my challenge that we face is that what we're looking for is people willing to share their data that doesn't benefit them, but does benefit the system. COVID was a good example that Tara gave, but there are many other examples in transport where I see that. Yeah, take, for example, mobile phone data, where people have unwittingly and provide us with the traces of their movements, which we use to help plan transport better. Whether they have been told that these benefits occur and whether these have been sort of made clear to them in terms of this is a good example of whether that's smart data or open data or not, and neither of the two, but sharing data is valuable. I think that to me is the question. There must be many other examples that we need to use to actually say, yeah, we have examples of where this is beneficial. You don't lose much, but you actually win quite a lot, even though you weren't aware of that you were part of that system.
Yeah, I think we've come to some of the questions that were raised earlier with the example of open banking and who is benefiting. Do panelists have any views on this kind of idea that perhaps it's the businesses that are benefiting? So why should I as an individual help them? How can we overcome that for transport?
So I think another example at the moment, so the bus franchising. So Manchester's the key example at the moment because they've just gone through that, but other areas are considering it. So that's another, I think, a fantastic opportunity where the smart data use and access bill could support, where the data is now being provided by operators to a public authority, and so they get a view of how citizens in the northwest and around Manchester are using public transport services, buses, and I believe trains soon as well. So we'll have lots of operators who will be sharing data into TFGM to give a much more holistic view of how their customers are traveling around the system, and then perhaps how the system needs to be altered. Maybe through that they'll be able to identify where there are issues where people can't access areas where there are jobs or education and so on. So I think we're already on the trend towards that, both in rail and buses at the moment.
And I think that's a good example. I think Afian, of people through whichever way they buy these services, they buy their tickets, they buy their travel cards, are contributing to that insight. So that is data that is being generated by people freely, making this data available to the operator, and ultimately the operator and TFGM hopefully is somehow combined, providing better services that will actually meet their needs. This is not an immediate impact on them themselves. It's an impact that works its way through the system, through a loop, to then making sure that either bus services are optimized. Sorry, Paul Spears, that bus optimization comes back in here, or that services are delivered that at the moment are not delivered, or that prices are kept down, whatever the benefits are of that sharing of data.
I think it's worth saying as well, in terms of who benefits from this, the hopeful answer is everyone benefits from this. It's not only consumers or only businesses. We want the data to work for everyone. Now, that's going to happen at different rates for different audiences here. And in the initial short term, we're hoping that that's going to benefit consumers, and whether those are individuals, businesses, small businesses, and so on. But ultimately, the data controllers, the data holders, should also be able to benefit in the long run, but they will face potentially disruption, more competition, they're going to have to up their own game as well. So there's a potential for everyone to benefit there. It's not either or in the long term.
No, I mean, if you take the open banking example, there was a huge sort of reluctance for the original CMA9 to adopt open banking, and they had to be forced to do it. Oh, somebody said the turkeys didn't vote for Christmas. They were forced to do it because they were doing monopolistic or oligopolistic practices amongst themselves to try and hold and retain those customers. So in a way, by using open banking, it fueled the fintech evolution to create new products, new services, new accessibility to data, and freed up an individual's data to be able to use it as they want. Yeah, sure, it scared the pants off of certain banks who were used to locking their customers in because, you know, you're less likely to change your bank account you were than you to change your spouse, for example. You know, now it enabled a lot more you to be a little bit more free and should say swappability, or the use of exchanging of going to another product if they offer you a better service. If it is to take your data out of what you did, it's no longer a data silo. It's no longer locked up and we can't access it. It's now interoperable, shareable, and under my control, which under GDPR is a right of the individual. And actually, if we think we're actually all been breaching that right, anybody that's done a website that hasn't enabled this right of the individual has been breaching the individual GDPR right of the individual for a long while.
I guess this brings us to a question we've got in the chat from Juliana. So data will be a critical input to AI usefulness. Is there a vital role for central government in imposing standards and mandatory real-time data sharing? How far does the Smart Data Initiative go towards that? Does anyone want to take that question?
The Smart Data Initiative, what that must be Hayden or Tara probably talking about that.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. Sort of, so can you walk through it slow, because there was 2 different points, and I'm not too sure if it merged.
Okay. So the first, is there a vital role for central government in imposing standards and mandatory real-time data sharing? So we've obviously talked about there are benefits to businesses, there are benefits to individuals, we need permission. Actually, do we need the government to step in and, you know, make it mandatory for certain things?
Well, the honest answer is legislation is coming, yes. Primary legislation is coming to mandate data sharing, but it's not in particular schemes. What it does, the first part of legislation is primary legislation unlocks the ability for scheme-specific legislation to come in. So that's very clear. Sorry, Tara, if I've stolen the thunder on that. And so there is no specific secondary legislation yet tabled for the transport and mobility sector. However, we are pushing for this to happen because it needs to happen. It's the customer's data, and we see the benefits of accessibility, of usability of data, interoperability of data, and data sharing. We see the absolute benefits that it can produce, and not just in our own sector, but sharing it with others as well. So, yes, the governments do have a role, and they are implementing it, and they force through. It was a CMA, the Competition Market Authority, that pushed through open banking, and the same thing is happening. So they actually, the government is taking its role of data sharing very seriously and is really driving this forward. Tara, Vysofts, is there anything else?
Yeah, I think I was going to come in on the standards side of things. So, you know, at the moment, you know, organizations under GDPR do have to, there is an obligation for, if you want your data shared with someone else, to do that. But there's no obligation in what sort of standard that information is shared to a third party. And so if I mean, if we take banking as an example, you know, you probably only have your data in sort of 2 or 3 places, but to build up a customer base, that third authorized third party is going to have to probably pull in data from 10 different banks. If each of those banks have a completely different way of sharing that via an API, that means that and they're not going to take the third party's API, it's going to be the bank's API to consume that data. That means that third party has got to build 9, 10 different ways of consuming that data. If you have a standard across it for smart data, it means that you only have to build that API. So the way for that data to move from one to the other and to communicate with each other, you only have to build it once because it's standardized. Now, when it comes to standards creation, there's a big question as to who creates those standards to ensure that it works for as many people as possible and that it is accepted and adopted and implemented. And what we've always said with this is that it needs both a top-down and a bottom-up approach to this. So you need someone at a high enough level who can drive the process and can ensure that certain monopolies don't get to dictate the way that benefits them and to the detriment of others. But you also need to ensure that people who have all of those insights, which can include those bigger monopolies, are all feeding into the design and development of that standard to make sure that it works with the context that's required as well. So yes, government is required for that in a lot of cases, or a senior trusted body, but it's not just them that's required. It needs others involved as well.
And it's just worth following up, Tara. We did so what we did to try and create the first set of open standards for transport data sharing. We literally pulled dozens and dozens of organizations into rooms. We did the Apollo 13 School of Management, where you lock them in the room and tell them you're sucking the air out till they come to a decision. Don't recommend that all the time, but it can work. And we actually were open to challenge from, when can we start to use it? What about this? What about that? And does it work across all modes, from walking through to airlines, through to car hire, through to car parking? Does it work for all modes? So we published our standards. We're not saying they're 100% correct. We're saying that currently they're a thing for the industry to start to use. If they don't meet your needs, don't go and invent new ones. Tell us for the benefit of society that we will create. We'll evolve them and develop them and incorporate them. But we're also looking at what other people are doing in the retail sector and the energy sector to make sure we don't create something that's different from what they're doing to try and enable interoperable to do cross-sector sharing as well. So we haven't picked unique standards for the way date and time and what everything is done. It's all common ways of data sharing that is accepted in a cross-sector way. But as I say, we would welcome everybody to take a look at our standards, and if they don't meet your needs, come and tell us, and we'll work with you and we'll evolve what we've got and we'll develop them further. So that's what we're trying to do, and all those standards are free, open, without anything available. So that's they're all there.
And if I can jump in there, Hayden, I think that you mentioned a number of I guess data sets and data usages that from the perspective where I start is that transport is not just about moving people, it's about achieving societal outcomes, where there are many data sets that, if they are accessible, open, use the same standards, could be brought in. Whether this is information from estate agents about house sales, whether this is information from particularly retail, or from schools, or from educational establishments, or from workplaces, where we can get insights into whether a particular transport intervention was associated not with that people moved faster or changed mode, but actually that we did achieve a societal benefit by greater inclusion, or by getting people to their jobs, as John Carr said in his example, where a single intervention which looked to be quite unsuccessful from a transport perspective, only 3 people used it, but these 3 people found work that they otherwise couldn't have access to. So I think that interchangeability between all these data sets, not just within transport, but related to the rest of society, will be absolutely essential to be able to show that this is not just about transport, is not just about moving people and goods.
Yeah, I'm just trying to cover all questions. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Tara.
No, I'm mindful of the time if you want to go to another question, but yeah, interoperability is key.
No, we just had a couple of questions about incorporating road car data, car usage data into modelling, if that's possible, and also mobile network data. So I'm just wondering if maybe perhaps Don or Avion have got some thoughts on that, mobile network data, car usage.
I'm struggling to see these questions. Sorry, where are we?
Let's go back up. I will just say to all people at the webinar, we've only got a few more minutes left, so my apologies if I've missed any questions. If there was anything particularly urgent that you want to make sure we get there, if you post it now at the bottom of the chat, I'll have a quick look and make sure we cover that up. We've got any thoughts how we can integrate MND, mobile network data, with ticketing data to help AI to infer, for example, journey purposes and decision making. Is that something that people want to talk about?
Well, it does some work with MND across, obviously, but you don't forget MND isn't personal data. MND purposely anonymizes data, keeps it to the nearest 10 people to purposely not identify individuals, because even if you don't personally identify them, you can re-identify individuals. It's a huge study in America where they collected open source taxi data and were able to reconstitute which pop stars were living where and going where very quickly, just from usage and not the individual. So re-identification will be very careful. So things like MMD, great, planning data, census data, all great for planning. But when it comes down to smart data, it's further up the data spectrum. This is individual data they're responsible for. So they all have different use cases. What we're kind of talking about is that sector one. But then from an AI perspective, you can have a personal AI model. You can just train your own data to do things and personal recommendations. Definitely smart data can work there.
Okay, thank you, Hayden. This question was, would bringing together data on car usage with public transport data enable a proper competition model to be built in which PT's biggest competitor is the private car and competition between operators is far less significant?
Yes. The honest answer is if you have got combined all different modes together via a common standard, and you can put all of those together, you can do modal comparisons, like what's the fastest, the cheapest, the greenest way of getting to somewhere or to use. So does that mean that, yes, everybody's on a zero-sum game with modes trying to compete with each other? Why aren't we picking the ones that is in the user's interest, the best one, and being able to create new services or recommend services that work in there in those? So yeah, all modes are often compete with each other's mode for the customer's time and money, but really it should be the customer that should be served the best from the best combination that meets their needs.
Thank you.
If I jump in there, Sally, I think this, we need to do a little bit more thinking about this, but I think this combination of individual data and particularly the individual trade-offs that people make between various choices that are available to them, and the more aggregated data about flows that we have available more across the board, will give us greater insights. It's for me understanding whether the smart data, as Hayden and Tara described, whether this will ever be available to us as transport planners in a way that doesn't lead to this risk that Hayden was referring to, that we can start reverse engineering individuals' trips that they actually that we actually so hard to try to avoid. So understand the behavior, but not represent the individuals that actually express that behavior. And by the way, Hayden, I think when I read that article, it wasn't just that we could identify which film star had made which trip, but also whether they paid a tip to the driver.
Okay, true to my promise, I've scrolled down to the bottom of the chat. So we've got, I think, possibly a final question here before I ask each of you to kind of summarize your main points from this. Transport operators are often reluctant to share data because the CMA has very negative views on how operators can work together for travellers' benefit. What do we think CMA could do differently to encourage data sharing?
I don't know exactly what
Tom,
CMA
your
does.
face
Yeah,
is still on the
yeah,
screen.
and I forgot to mute as well. So sorry, I don't know what the Competition and Markets Authority really does and how it can or cannot influence what operators do.
Well, the honest answer is that the government, CMA, and Department of Transport, and everybody is looking to implement smart data. Government is serious. It was in the King's speech about smart data and implementing this. So I really think the government has really stepped up. If I'm absolutely honest, governments can be usually quite slow. Our government, the previous one and now in the King's speech, it was announced this government is really pushing forward smart data. They've lit the fire under it. And actually, it's the transport sector that's behind. You know, with the recent, literally it was only last week that there was the open call for open energy for use cases for taking it forward for their smart data roadmap. We're way behind open banking, finance, energy, utilities. The transport sector is way behind in data sharing.
Why? Why is the transport sector way behind?
A combination of large infrastructure projects tend to take longer, so we have that there. Sometimes we have a fixed number of suppliers that tend to have rather monopolistic practices, and there is a resistance to understand the value. Also, I think we're poor in communicating the value exchange, the data exchange, where it is with our customers. We don't really do loyalty across multimodal schemes, across encouraging people in any way. Retail's been doing it for decades. So I think it's actually also, there's only, and somebody's just popped up, Patricia, thank you. The last point is, we're a much more fragmented, deregulated sector than the 9 banks, the 100 financial services companies that are going to be part of open finance. We're much more fragmented. I said, before, 26 different train operating companies just in the UK. There's hundreds of scooter operators, micromobility, taxi companies, bus companies. I live in Scotland, the buses are even more deregulated. How we're going to get them all together is huge. So we have a big uphill struggle because we're such fragmented in our sector. That doesn't mean we don't do it. It just means we've got a bigger challenge, and we should learn from how other sectors and do it well. Tara can help us by citing best practice from across our different organizations and how sectors do it. But we need to step up as a sector and say, this is coming. If we don't do something, we may be forced to do it and do it quite quickly. And therefore, I suggest we start doing it now and adopting it and considering it.
Thanks very much, Hayden. So I think my takeout from these sessions is the data is there, and the technology is there to analyze the data. There are benefits to passengers, there's benefits to society, there are benefits to business. There is the potential for everybody to win. The challenge is actually the sharing that data. That would be my quite simplistic takeout from this. Can I ask each of you in turn to just give me just a brief summary statement, your thoughts for this morning's session? Should we start with you, Tom?
Yes, why not? Yeah, I think this has been really interesting for me as well. And once again, apologies for the slides not working the way in which they were intended. I am taken away that although I don't like the term smart data, I think we got to accept that smart data is something that's happening. And for us as transport planners, not just looking, as I said, at what we do within transport, but particularly also what the impacts are of transport on society, on people, on business as well, is having a look at how can we engage with smart data in a way that protects that individual anonymity, but benefits us in terms of making what we do as transport, as an integrated transport system better.
Thank you very much, Tom. You've been fantastic. Tara, any final comments, please?
I think I'll just say I've heard a few different interesting ideas of how transport data can be combined with other data to come up with new and innovative solutions. So it's a bit of a shameless plug, but I do recommend, first of all, have a look at the smart data roadmap if this is something that's new to you. I mean, that's not a plug for me, that's a general thing. But also the challenge that we're running, smartdata.challenges.org, it is looking for cross-sector use cases. Transport is one of the priority sectors, and there is synthetic data that has been created about transport for people to play around and model with. So if you are one of those people that's been putting really interesting suggestions in the chat, please do have a look at that.
Thank you so much, Tara. That was really useful. Hayden, final comments?
We are obviously unsurprisingly going to be submitting an application for the Smart Data Challenge. It's open knowledge that we are, because we're driving forward our sector. But if anybody wants to talk to us about that, about how they are thinking about doing it themselves and what is already out in the ecosystem that can help and accelerate their work, we happily share everything we've got because it's all in the public domain. The last final thing is that if you just want to understand more, we've got a monthly call about smart data with transport to try and pull together what we know, who else is doing stuff, what best practice is, and try and take people on. So if anybody from Sistra wants to join through, Tom, if you want to come along and hear more, or anybody else, and Tara, we have your colleagues, Emma and Josh, who join us so far. Please, it is an open invitation call to come along and just see what we've been doing and see, can you learn from it, other people benefit. We're not going to do this by ourselves. We're not going to do it in a vacuum. We're going to do it by taking this lovely, great sector you're working forward and using smart data in a way that really helps everybody.
Thank you so much, Hayden, for your time this morning. And Avian, just
Yeah,
quick
no
last
problem.
comments.
Yeah, no, really enjoyed the discussion. So thank you. So my final thoughts is yesterday was a huge flurry of infrastructure investment announcements, and we know that's going to take a long time and go round and round. And I think we can make a lot more progress and support better travellers in a better way by using smart data, unlocking and addressing some of the challenges that we've talked about today. So that's my final thought.
Thank you so much, panelists. I've learnt a lot. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you, Sistra, for sponsoring this event. There are more events taking place, so please check the chat for details from Juliana, and everybody have a lovely day. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thanks.